Hey everybody, it's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and thanks for joining me for this final episode of the Split Second Set Review of Core Set 2019, where I give you just a sentence or two about every card in the set, just to give you an idea of what to expect out of your cards for Limited, especially when the pre-releases come around. This time we'll be looking at the rest of the set, including all the multicolor cards, the artifacts, and the lands, and they've all been lumped together. Remember, this is in order of playability according to my first impressions of the set. So the worst cards will be first, and the best cards we will save towards the end of the video. Let's go and hop right in, shall we? Crucible World is just like Scapeshift. It's mythic rare here, not because it's great in the limited format, but because it's going to sell packs. Crucible doesn't do anything particularly unique in this set. There's not even something like Evolving Wilds to take advantage of it. So yeah, you're going to take this for the money, but you're not going to play it in your limited deck. Reliquary Tower, again, is a great reprint for certain casual or commander players. It's not a card you should ever be taking for limited purposes, and honestly, if you have more than 7 cards in your hand, there's probably something wrong, or you're probably winning enough without this. Protection Tower is another card you're not taking very highly. It does have a tiny bit of upside, but to my knowledge, there's only 3 creatures in this set that have hexproof and no way to give yourself hexproof, so the activated ability just isn't going to come up. It still taps for mana, so I guess there's that, and it's a sideboard card against those 3 specific cards, but otherwise, it's not a card you need to prioritize. Magistrate Scepter is a very weird reprint. It just costs so much mana to get it going. 3 plus 3 activations of 4 each. That's 15 mana total, and you still have to be able to tap it the turn after just to take 1 extra turn. Extra turns are overrated in Limited, and if you think this card is great, you're probably overrating it too. Amulet of Safekeeping is another one of these cards that we've seen in each color that's designed to work in modern or older formats, specifically for Storm. It's not a card that does too much in the limited format, but the token effect could be decent against some of the white decks in this format. Millstone's here, and by itself, it's not a great card. Unless you're winning with a mill strategy, there's no reason to include Millstone in your deck in the first place. I can see this being useful in some of the black decks where you want to fill up your own graveyard, but I think you can do better than Millstone when it comes to that strategy. Fountain of Renewal is another card that I might be underrating here. I know a lot of people like this card, and sure, it'll gain you 5 to 6, maybe even more life than that. Plus, it'll replace itself at a later point in the game. If you're in the type of deck that needs the repeated life gain trigger, then sure, I could see playing this, but for the most part, I don't think it's as impactful as it looks. Desecrated Tomb is another card that I mentioned in my build-around video. There are about 7 to 10 cards that work with this and trigger it, and very few ways to really take advantage of it. If you find that you're going down this route, I don't think people are going to be first picking the Tomb very often, so you might be able to snag one in certain decks, but it's not a card that might be worth building around, just one that leads to certain interest and decisions as far as your draft picks go. Field Creeper is a creature that exists again for some reason, and I guess they didn't want to print a better artifact creature for the set, but there are artifact themes in the set, and sometimes you just need to find that crucial artifact, so Field Creeper you could definitely do worse than, but you can certainly do better as well. Chaos Wand is the type of card that intrigues me, but probably won't be good even at its best moments. A lot of times, if you can snag removal off of this, then it's definitely going to justify its spot, but if you start hitting things like counter spells and pump spells, or just cards that don't particularly matter, you're wasting your mana and basically your whole turn to activate this ability. Marauders acts as playable equipment, but it's not fantastic equipment. There are some decks that'll win with putting this on flyers, and I find it to be especially decent in decks with Thopters, so if you have a bunch of evasive creatures or you're just a go-wide token strategy, Marauders acts might be up your alley. Diamond Mare is another one of these creatures that is here for the life gain. If you have a deck that cares about life gain, then sure, Diamond Mare is just fine, and it blocks pretty decently early in the game. The life gain doesn't particularly matter for most decks, though, so you can do better than this card in the average deck. I'm just saying, pick it highly if you need the life, and otherwise leave it alone. Gearsmith Guardian is another card that fits very well into the blue-based artifact decks. It's a beater for that color, and blue doesn't often get things like this, so I would take this pretty highly. It is pretty bad if you don't have a lot of blue creatures, though, so if you're blue-white, but you're majority white, then Gearsmith Guardian is not really the card you're looking for. Manalith is here for mana fixin' and mana ramp. I expect the green-red decks will want to play this quite a bit, and I'm a huge fan of just being able to fix your mana in general and splash in color, so I can see myself picking a Manalith pretty highly. Gargoyle Sentinel is a card that I generally like just because it blocks just fine and never really has to attack to justify its spot. Obviously, it gets better if you are attacking with it. This is here again because of Arkadys. You notice the defenders in this set are kind of weirdly placed, but you'll play a Gargoyle Sentinel as a filler card, and not too exciting, not too bad either. Rogue's Glove is another card that fits into the same decks as the Marauder's Axe. If you have a bunch of evasive creatures, either unblockable ones or flying creatures, then Rogue's Glove is pretty good, but otherwise, if you're just trying to attack in a normal average deck, then it's probably not a card you want to include too often. Dragon's Horde has a lot of potential as a build-around, but as I mentioned in my build-around video, there aren't actually a lot of dragons that you can get that aren't uncommons, rares, or mythics in this set, so don't expect to draw too many cards off this, but it is a glorified Manalith. At the very least, it's a mana rock that fixes and helps you splash, and if you ever draw cards off of it, that's just upside as far as I'm concerned. Well, I get to talk about Suspicious Bookcase here. I actually think this card is just fine for decks that don't have a lot of evasion already. Basically, it turns all of your beaters into creatures that can get through without being blocked, and I like that quite a bit on a defender that blocks early enough in the game. It's decent in the flyer-based decks, and it's probably pretty good in the big creature decks too, where it turns into a Rogue's Passage, essentially, giving evasion to your big creatures that don't already have it. Arcane Encyclopedia is the type of card you pick up when you end up drafting a color that doesn't already have a lot of card draw. If I'm in blue and I have access to Divination and Sift and things like that, I don't need this, but if I find myself in white, red, green maybe, that doesn't have a lot of its own card advantage, then I could see definitely playing this as a card in my deck. The next spot goes to all of the Duel Lands in the set, which thankfully are common this time around. I've already mentioned I like splashing, and I like just having good mana in general, so I could see these being middle to high picks in a lot of decks. They open up opportunities to play 3-color decks, and they're pretty good to have in just your average 2-color decks as well. Rupture Spire gets a tad bit of a nod above the Duel Lands that we just mentioned. It's a little bit of a downside to have to put this in tapped and use up a mana, so if you're planning on playing this turn 1 to 2, well, you're going to have to give up your first 2 turns, but it's fine later on. It sets up your splash and it fixes your mana. You'll take this if you feel like you're going to end up 3 colors, and if you're a 2-color deck, you don't need it. Explosive Apparatus is another card that I would define as, quote-unquote, just fine. It fills that artifact requirement for a lot of the other cards in this set, so if you need a mass of artifacts, then you can pick this up, and if you're really light on removal, this can do the trick. Satyr Enchanter. 3, 2, 1. Satyr Enchanter is, in my opinion, the worst of the gold cards in the set. It's great if you have enchantments, obviously, but I don't see a theme coming together too often that's focused on green-white enchantments. If you have a couple, then you really want this card, and a lot of other people aren't going to be interested in it, so look to wheel it in packs when you end up in this color combination. Skyscanner seems like a great card to me. This is actually pretty close to something like Pilgrim's Eye or Skitterin' Surveyor. Obviously not as good, but the fact that it puts an artifact on board for the decks that need it and always replaces itself, and even chumps block if you're top decking, I think this will be a fine card. Brawl Batch Ogre is the highlight of our black-red decks here. If you have active trees, this card gets great, and if you have a bunch of sack fodder, then it attacks very well. It's not amazing if you're just playing it in an average deck that has, a normal number of creatures. If you're sacrificing real creatures to this effect, then you're probably playing it wrong. But if you have active trees and sacrifice fodder, it goes up in value. Enigma Drake is another card that's obviously fantastic, but I just don't see blue-red coming together too often. Enigma Drake and Gutter Snipe are really the only headliners, and they're both uncommons, but if you end up in that strategy, you're looking for this card and cheap cantrips like Crash Through to fill up your graveyard. Poison Tip Archer is a weird card. It's obviously very good, but black-green doesn't seem to have a real defined theme to its color combination. If you end up in the color somehow, you're always playing this. I'm not entirely sure it's worth splashing for, but it does make trading off creatures very profitable, and it has a good combination of abilities and stats for its mana cost. Aerial Engineer goes way up in value if you have a bunch of artifacts, and way down in value if you only have, say, 2 to 3. 4/4 flyer and a 2/4 with no evasion is such a huge delta that if you don't have the artifacts, I'm really not looking to pick this card up, but it definitely rewards you for drafting the blue-white artifact-based deck. Meteor Golem is expensive. It's a 7-mana 3/3, but it comes down and pops your opponent's most annoying card as long as it's not hexproof, and that to me seems like a good deal. This is the type of card that gives you removal in decks that might not otherwise have it, and seems like it'll go early in a pack. I think this card is going to be good, and it'll probably be at its best in green decks when you can ramp it out. Skyrider Patrol is very similar to the green-black elf that we just saw. It doesn't have a very well-defined theme for its color combinations, but the card itself is very good. So again, if you end up in those color combinations, if you somehow end up in a blue-green deck, then you could get rewarded with this card, but blue-green doesn't seem like it's going to come together that often. Peconic Scifo is the highlight of the red-green deck, which is basically a ramp deck. Sure, there's some dragon synergy here, and if you have that, then that's great. Keep in mind, this is one of the few cards that makes a dragon, but isn't actually a dragon itself, which enhances some of the strategies in this format. I think this card is just great on its own, since a 3-mana that ramps you ahead and then turns into a real threat is fantastic, and I'm looking to pick this card pretty early in the packs. Regal Bloodlord is the highlight of the black-white deck, and it definitely pays you off for having some of those cards we mentioned earlier in this video, the sources of continuous life gain from turn to turn. If you make a couple bats off of this, you should be able to take over a game, and keep in mind, this triggers on your opponent's end step too if you can somehow gain life during their turn. Heroic Reinforcements is the type of card that you just lose to out of nowhere. It already makes 4 power worth of haste creatures by itself and works as a pump as well. This is exactly what you're looking for a red-white go-wide strategy, and I imagine you'll win a lot of games where you get to cast this. Transmogrifying Long seems like a fantastic first pick to me. It's repeated creature removal, and yes, it replaces those creatures with 2/4s, but it's going to take out your opponent's 3 best creatures, and anytime they play a threat, you can replace it with a 2/4. As long as a 2/4 is not threatening you too highly, you can definitely be safe using this card repeatedly until you've taken care of all of the threats your opponent has. There are times where you can use it on your own creatures too to upgrade them into 2/4s if you consider a 2/4 an upgrade to whatever you're using it on. So in general, the Sultai colors, blue, black, and green, don't have solid themes to their 2-color combinations, and I've already mentioned that with 2 of the other gold cards, but Psychic Symbiont gets a nod over the others just on pure power level. The fact that it's a natural 3-for-1 and puts a flying threat on the board just seems fantastic, and I expect this is the type of card that's going to be very damaging to play against. Arkadys is, in my opinion, probably the worst of the Elder Dragons, which is saying quite a bit because the card's actually pretty absurd. It's a neat build-around, and you've seen all these defenders that we've looked at in the videos. They're basically in the set because Arkadys exists with its abilities. If you ever draw a couple cards off this, it's great, and Arkadys is good enough on its own that you don't have to force the defender strategy. Keep in mind, you need a backup plan if you're going all in on defenders, because if Arkadys dies, you're stuck with a deck full of 0/5s and 0/3s, so if you draft Arkadys and go down the defender route, make sure you have a backup plan in your deck. Sigiled Sword of Valor gets a nod above Arkadys just for being colorless. Colorless cards like this are insanely good most of the time, and I feel like this card takes over games very quickly. Once you've equipped it to the first creature and gotten an attack in, you start generating tokens, and if they kill the equipped creature, you can just put this on the generated token and keep it rolling. Kind of like a mini Helm of the Host. Doesn't take over the game quite as quickly, but definitely puts the damage in once you've got it rolling. Next up on our dragon list is Victus the Dire. The reason this is lower than some of the others, even though it's a pretty cool effect, is that if it attacks, you have to choose something. You don't have the choice. You have to choose something of your own and something of an opponent's, which a lot of times will be an advantage since you get to pick off your opponent's best card and oftentimes pick off something like a land from yourself and replace those with random permanents. But this could backfire. You could get just a spell on top of your library and you could hit your opponent's bomb. So I don't think that's going to happen too often, and Victus is still a 6/6 flyer, which can win the game on its own with massive upside, but I could see it backfire every now and then. Palladium Moors I have ranked slightly higher than Victus, although it might be a little bit worse. Victus has a little bit of an engine feel to it, whereas Palladium Moors is basically just a beater. The fact that it has hexproof, though, is really what's given it the nod here, since it will be safe from removal until it's at least hit one time. Basically, you always guarantee that you're going to be able to deal damage with this, and honestly, there's not a lot of removal that kills it anyway, so it's still going to take over the game if they can't deal with it. Narrowing things down, we have Nickelbo as the Ravager here, which is basically just an absurd card if you can cast it on turn 4. It's the type of card you're looking for Duel Lands for and things that are going to fix your mana, things like Manalith, because it really is egregious once it hits the battlefield. It's already going to get that card out of your opponent's hand just for hitting the battlefield, which means if they kill it right away, sure, you already got an advantage, and it's just going to take over the game from there. 4-mana 4/4 flyer is fantastic. The Planeswalker side is enough to basically take over the game, and sometimes you don't even have to transform this to win a game, since a 4/4 flyer is just a huge beater. And my vote for straight up best card in the entire M19 set is Chromium the Mutable. 7-mana 7/7 flash flyer is already pretty good on its own, and not being able to be countered means it's going to get around Bone to Ash and Essence Scatter and Cancel, or most of these sideboard cards that can take things like this out, and then the discard effect just makes it unkillable. It's basically unable to be blocked at most points in the game, and if they ever try to kill it before blocks, you can activate the ability, and it becomes unblockable. It's so difficult to get rid of Chromium that it's basically game over as soon as it hits the board. Pretty absurd card, and I'm not looking forward to playing against it. And that takes care of everything. We're done with all the videos. We mentioned every single card in the set, and I've given you a couple sentences to get you geared for your pre-releases. Now, one thing I'd like to hear from you guys is, do you like these split-second reviews? I realized after editing some of the videos that by split-second, I meant about 15 minutes. So maybe the name's not too accurate, but if you like this format for reviewing cards, let me know below, and any feedback would be great. Maybe I need more detail, maybe I need to do something else with the video. This is the place to let me know here on YouTube. You can always find me on Twitter too. I just made a Twitter account not too long ago, and I'm not versed in the ways of Twitter, but if you want to find us, you can find us at MTG_Manarocks. Again, thank you guys for joining me for these split-second reviews, and I hope you enjoyed them, and I hope for somebody out there they're useful for your pre-releases and your first couple drafts. So good luck on your pools, have fun, and as always, I'll see y'all next time.